The Level 2 alarm tore through the control room before anyone could speak. A metallic scream that meant one thing: Reactor 4 was failing. On the main screen, toxic gas levels shot past federal limits, flashing red like a dying pulse. The east containment valves began to shudder, then visibly destabilize. 200 night shift workers were still inside the facility. That was the moment I should have acted without hesitation. And believe me, I almost did. But hold that thought for a second, and let me know. Where are you listening right now, and what's the temperature where you are? I read every single comment. Okay, now let me tell you what happened next. I was already at Central Command. Prepare Level 3 containment. I ordered. Calm. Measured. Level 3 isolates the reactor, redistributes internal pressure, and shuts production down. It costs money. It saves lives. The gas readings climbed again. Then Neil Kroick walked in. No protective gear, no sense of urgency, just polished shoes on industrial flooring. Stand down, he said. This doesn't require theatrics. I didn't turn around. We're seconds from mandatory escalation. You're overreacting, he replied. Then, loud enough for the entire control team to hear, you're done. Daisy, effective immediately. The room froze. You're firing me, I said evenly. Yes. 27 years of service ended in a sentence. I unclipped my badge and placed it beside the console. Then, I am no longer authorized to issue containment commands. No one touched the controls. On the screen, a system notification appeared. Incident Commander Authorization. Revoked. Replacement pending. And the alarm kept screaming. What follows is a dramatized story, aided by artificial intelligence, aimed at storytelling and enhancing the emotional experience. It does not represent any real-life individuals, companies, or events. If you're looking for sharp lessons packed into a tense atmosphere, you'll enjoy this. But if it's late where you are and your day is tiring, that's okay too. Put this aside, rest, take care of yourself. We'll still be here waiting for you when you're ready. The moment my badge left the console, 27 years flashed through my mind with brutal clarity. I started at this plant when Reactor 4 was still considered state-of-the-art. I helped draft the first comprehensive emergency response framework after a minor valve rupture in '98. I trained 3 generations of engineers. I redesigned our containment hierarchy after the federal revisions in 2012. The Level 3 containment protocol Neil had just dismissed, I built that after modeling 37 failure scenarios, including cascading valve instability, exactly like the one blinking red on our screens now. For nearly 3 decades, my job was simple: anticipate the worst before it happened, and I was very good at it. Under my supervision, we reduced reportable incidents by 42%. Insurance premiums dropped by $22 million over 10 years. We passed every Environmental Protection Agency audit without a single critical violation. I knew the plant's weak points the way a cardiologist knows arterial plaque. Neil Kroick had been CEO for 8 months. In his first quarterly review, he cut 18% from the safety budget. Preventive maintenance intervals were extended. 2 senior compliance engineers were replaced with contract analysts. When I objected, he smiled like I'd insulted his spreadsheet. Your system is over-engineered, he said. We don't need gold-plated paranoia. Gold-plated paranoia. That was how he described the protocols that kept 200 workers breathing. Back in the control room, the gas concentration ticked higher. East wing sensors flickered again. One of the junior engineers whispered, "Pressure's building in the auxiliary line." Neil folded his arms. If you'd streamlined these procedures like I asked, we wouldn't be hesitating. Hesitating. The hesitation wasn't procedural. It was legal, without a registered incident commander. No one could authorize Level 3 escalation without assuming personal liability. That wasn't fear. That was federal compliance. The room felt tighter now. Not hotter, just narrower. The air thick with more than gas. I watched the containment timer advance. Every second without escalation increased exposure risk and downstream damage. This was precisely why the chain of command existed, to eliminate ego from emergencies. Then I noticed something on the wall-mounted display I hadn't seen before. The board's remote session indicator was active. The executive meeting had never disconnected, which meant the audio feed from this control room, every word, every order, every dismissal was being archived automatically in the corporate server. Neil didn't realize it, but his decision to fire the federally registered incident commander mid-crisis wasn't just witnessed, it was recorded. The next 9 minutes didn't explode in chaos. They unfolded in slow, methodical damage. Minute 1 began with arguing. "I'm giving the order," Neil said, stepping toward the central console as if proximity equaled authority. "You don't have authorization." Marcus, our senior process engineer, replied carefully. His voice wasn't defiant. It was procedural. Neil snapped back. "This is a containment issue, not a constitutional crisis." It was both. Without a registered incident commander, activating Level 3 meant the signer assumed full regulatory liability if escalation was deemed unnecessary. That included potential criminal exposure under federal environmental statutes. No one in that room was reckless enough to volunteer. Minute 2 gas concentration rose another 0.8%. Minute 3, the east containment valves oscillated harder. The auxiliary pressure line began to compensate automatically, which meant internal strain was building elsewhere. I stood 3 steps away from the console, legally silent, professionally screaming. By minute 4, the pressure readings crossed the internal advisory threshold. "Auxiliary line is absorbing load," Marcus said. "But it won't hold long." Neil leaned over the console. "Then, isolate reactor 4 manually." "We can't," someone answered. "Manual override requires commander clearance." That clearance had been revoked with witnesses. Minute 5, the system rerouted flow to prevent rupture. That rerouting forced gas into the east storage corridor faster than projected. Sensors there flickered from yellow to red. Minute 6, the first alarm from the downstream filtration array triggered. That meant the overload wasn't localized anymore. We were now managing spread. Neil's jaw tightened. "This delay is costing us." "No," I thought. "This decision is costing you." Minute 7 is when the auxiliary system began to fail. Not catastrophically, not explosively, just mathematically. Pressure variance exceeded design tolerance. The automated dampers attempted correction, but without full isolation. They were compensating against active production flow. "Auxiliary is overheating," Marcus said. Minute 8, containment foam deployed automatically in the east corridor, but not at level 3 density. That meant partial suppression, not full lockdown. Minute 9, the system overloaded its secondary scrubbers. That was the point of no return, not in terms of human casualty, but in financial impact. Once scrubbers exceed capacity, contamination risk expands from operational to regulatory. That distinction matters. Operational damage costs money. Regulatory damage multiplies it. By the time full shutdown was finally executed, under emergency board authorization, the cascade was already in motion. 72 hours of mandatory production suspension. A $65 million export contract automatically voided due to force majeure clauses triggered by environmental noncompliance. Preliminary regulatory penalties estimated at $28 million. And by market close the next day, our stock had dropped 11%, erasing $87 million in market capitalization. $180 million. 9 minutes. But the numbers weren't what haunted me. It was the silence in minute 1. The hesitation born not of incompetence, but of structure removed mid-crisis. Hours later, in the executive conference room, the damage report was being assembled. I wasn't invited, but I was present as a compliance witness. No one was shouting anymore. Financial officers spoke in tight sentences. Risk analysts avoided eye contact. Then the general counsel cleared her throat. "We need exact timestamps." Neil looked up. "For what?" "For termination and for attempted containment authorization." She replied evenly. "Down to the minute." The room shifted. She continued. "Regulators will ask when the registered incident commander was relieved of duty relative to escalation delay." Silence again. "Different this time?" "Not confusion, Calculation, because once the timeline is documented, causation becomes traceable, and timestamps don't care about executive ego. They care about sequence, Neil finally said. Are you suggesting this was my fault? The general counsel didn't answer directly. She simply repeated, "We need precise timestamps." And suddenly, the 9 minutes felt longer than ever. By the next morning, the numbers were no longer theoretical. They were printed, circulated, and attached to emergency board memoranda. But what truly shifted the atmosphere inside the company wasn't the $180 million. It was a sentence. Neil's sentence. "We don't need rigid emergency hierarchies slowing us down." He had said it in the control room, moments before terminating my authority. The board's remote session had been live. The audio feed archived automatically into the corporate server under compliance retention policy. By noon, that sentence had been transcribed. I was called into a smaller conference room that afternoon, not as an employee, but as a technical witness. My termination stood, my expertise, apparently, still held value. The general counsel, Laura Chen, slid a printed transcript across the table. Her tone was neutral, but precise. "Daisy, can you explain what rigid emergency hierarchies refers to in operational terms?" "It refers to federally mandated command structure," I answered. "Specifically, the registered incident commander authorization required for Level 3 escalation." She nodded slightly. "And removing that authorization mid-incident creates a decision vacuum," I said. "No one below that level can legally assume command without documented transfer." Neil's words were no longer bravado, they were context. In regulatory investigations, context determines negligence. Later that day, the board held a closed executive session. I wasn't inside, but I knew the framework. When environmental exposure is involved, liability expands beyond operational loss. It reaches executive accountability. The problem wasn't that a gas leak occurred. Industrial facilities experience incidents. The issue was timing, the timestamp of my termination, the timestamp of attempted escalation, the timestamp of system overload. In legal review, sequence establishes causation. By evening, external counsel had been retained. That was not routine. That was containment of a different kind. And then the call came. The Environmental Protection Agency had formally requested preliminary documentation. Not a casual inquiry, a written request. They wanted incident logs, command authorization records, budget allocation adjustments for safety maintenance, and transcripts of executive communications during the event. Laura forwarded the notice to the board. I saw Neil's name copied on the email chain. This was no longer internal. Federal review doesn't focus on personality conflicts. It focuses on procedural deviation. If established safety hierarchy was intentionally disregarded, regulators would examine whether leadership actions materially contributed to delay. The following morning, I was asked to provide a written technical statement. I kept it clinical. Level 3 containment protocol requires activation by a federally registered incident commander. Termination of authorization at 2:14 a.m. preceded attempted escalation at approximately 2:17 a.m. No adjectives, no emotion. Facts carry their own gravity. Later, I learned that during the executive session, one board member asked Neil directly, "Were you aware that revoking commander authorization would prevent immediate escalation?" Neil reportedly responded, "I assumed the system allowed operational flexibility. Assumption is not a regulatory defense." That phrase, rigid emergency hierarchies, had now become the focal point. External counsel flagged it as potentially problematic language. It suggested conscious dismissal of established safety governance. In federal review, intent doesn't require malice. It requires knowledge of structure and decision to bypass it. The company's compliance archive confirmed that Neil had signed off on annual safety hierarchy documentation less than 4 months prior. That signature mattered, because once the Environmental Protection Agency examines documentation, they ask one central question: was the protocol insufficient, or was it interrupted by late afternoon? Another request arrived. The Environmental Protection Agency wanted complete board meeting records from the hour surrounding the incident, full transcripts, audio files, timestamp verification. The board had no choice but to comply. And just like that, Neil's offhand remark was no longer a management style. It was evidence. By the third day, Neil shifted from defense to offense. The internal investigation had barely begun when he called a press briefing. I wasn't invited, but I watched the live stream from my kitchen table, the same table where I had reviewed emergency response revisions for years. Our former safety director abandoned her post during a critical incident. Neil said into the cameras. His tone was calm, rehearsed. That delay contributed to operational damage. Former safety director abandoned. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The implication was surgical. For a brief moment, I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in the control room: anger. Not loud anger, not dramatic. The kind that tightens your spine and steadies your breathing. I did not abandon my post. I was terminated. There is a difference. Within an hour, my phone began vibrating. Former colleagues, reporters, one board member I'd mentored years ago. I didn't call anyone back. Instead, I opened my laptop at 2:14 a.m. The termination had been verbally issued. At 2:15 a.m., my badge access had been deactivated in the system. I had documented the event immediately upon exiting the control room. The email was still there. Subject line: Command Authority Relinquishment. Compliance Notice. I reread it carefully before forwarding it. Upon termination at 2:14 a.m., I formally relinquish Incident Commander Authority in accordance with federal safety governance. Escalation authority remains unassigned pending board designation. No adjectives, no accusations, just sequence. I forwarded the message to the full board distribution list and copied General Counsel. Then I waited. By afternoon, Neil attempted a second narrative internally. An executive memo circulated, claiming that operational leadership confusion caused the delay. Confusion. That word was strategic. It implied systemic ambiguity rather than executive decision. But there had been no confusion in the control room. There had been structure removed late that evening. I received a call from Marcus, our senior process engineer. His voice was lower than usual. "Daisy," he said. They're asking who hesitated. I already knew the answer. No one hesitated. I replied. There was a pause. They want to know why no one signed the Level 3 authorization, because signing it would have meant assuming federal liability without registered authority, because compliance isn't optional, because we are engineers, not gamblers. Marcus exhaled slowly. I told them the truth. What truth? That without a registered incident commander, we couldn't legally authorize escalation. He went quiet again before adding. They asked if I was afraid to sign. And were you? I asked. Yes, he said plainly. Afraid of prison. That landed heavier than any financial figure. The next morning, 3 engineers submitted written statements. Each one confirmed the same fact without designated command authority. Activating Level 3 independently would have exposed them to personal regulatory liability. No one refused to act. They refused to break the law. By midday, those statements reached the board. Neil responded quickly. He called the engineer's interpretation overly cautious. Overly cautious. The phrase echoed his earlier dismissal of rigid hierarchies, except now it wasn't just my word against his. It was documented professional testimony. Later that afternoon, General Counsel scheduled individual interviews. I was informed that the board had requested clarification on one specific issue. Was escalation technically possible without me? Yes. Was it legally protected? No. That distinction matters in federal review. By evening, the narrative began to fracture. It wasn't a story about abandonment anymore. It was a story about authority removed mid-incident. And when one board member asked Marcus directly whether he felt empowered to sign after my termination, his answer was reportedly simple no. I wasn't authorized, and I wasn't willing to risk felony charges to compensate for executive optics. That sentence traveled fast, because unlike press conferences, sworn statements don't bend easily, and suddenly, Neil wasn't defending against numbers. He was defending against professionals who refused to carry his liability. If you agree that sending that time-stamped compliance email and refusing to let them rewrite the truth was the right move, drop a 1 in the comments, because when you speak up, you don't just support me, you reinforce that accountability still matters. By the end of that week, the financial damage had moved from projections to formal claims. 72 hours of suspended production had already been calculated into quarterly loss adjustments. The $65 million export contract was officially terminated under force majeure. Regulatory penalties were still under review, but the preliminary figure of $28 million was now circulating among analysts. The stock decline 11% had stabilized, but the $87 million in erased market capitalization was real. Naturally, the company filed its insurance claim. Industrial environmental policies exist for exactly this reason: unexpected mechanical failure, contamination exposure, business interruption. The insurer assigned a rapid response team within hours. Loss assessment specialists arrived on site. Legal liaisons began collecting documentation. For a brief moment, it seemed like the financial hemorrhage might at least be contained. Then the insurer asked a simple question: who was the registered incident commander at the time of Level 3 activation? There was a pause on the call. I'm told, because that question doesn't concern engineering, it concerns authorization. The formal response from Corporate Risk Management stated that Level 3 was activated under Emergency Board Directive after escalation delay. The insurer followed up: please provide documentation of authorized command transfer at the time of initial escalation attempt. That document did not exist. The silence inside executive offices reportedly stretched longer than any silence inside the control room that night. I wasn't included in the insurance conference calls, but I received copies of the inquiry through compliance channels. My name appeared repeatedly in the documentation trail, not as liability, but as reference. Former incident commander, authorization revoked at 2:14 a.m. Escalation attempt at approximately 2:17 a.m. Activation executed later under extraordinary directive. Insurance contracts are written with surgical language. They define coverage not only by event, but by adherence to protocol. If procedural safeguards are bypassed or compromised through executive action, coverage may be limited or contested. That's when the term surfaced: valid authority clause. I had reviewed that clause during our annual policy renewal the previous year. It required that high-level containment protocols be initiated by a properly designated and federally registered command authority unless immediate life safety override applied. In this case, life safety override had not been declared at the moment of attempted escalation, because no one had been authorized to declare it. The insurer's legal representative requested full compliance documentation, including proof that established safety governance remained intact at the time of incident onset. It had not. Termination of the registered incident commander mid-event constituted a structural alteration of governance. The insurer did not deny the claim outright. They suspended it. Suspension is quieter than denial, but more dangerous. It signals review for potential breach of policy conditions. By Monday morning, internal risk assessment teams were calculating worst-case exposure if insurance reimbursement were reduced. The figures were staggering. Without coverage support, the net financial impact could exceed $200 million once regulatory multipliers and civil liabilities were fully accounted for. Neil reportedly argued that activation had ultimately occurred. It had. But insurance does not assess outcome alone. It assesses compliance at time of decision. A separate letter arrived that afternoon. The insurer formally invoked review under the valid authority clause, citing possible interruption of designated command structure prior to escalation delay. That clause had rarely been triggered in the company's history. It had never been triggered because of executive termination. I received a message from General Counsel requesting clarification on one detail. Had I formally transferred command authority to any subordinate prior to my dismissal? No, I replied, Because I was dismissed without transition window. Her response was brief. Understood. That word carried weight. The board now faced a second crisis layered over the first. Not only had the incident produced operational and regulatory damage, but executive action may have compromised financial recovery mechanisms designed to absorb such damage. The ripple effect was precise: production loss, contract termination, regulatory scrutiny, market decline, insurance suspension, each one traceable back to the same pivot point removal of authorized command during active escalation window. Later that evening, I learned that one board member asked Neil directly whether he had reviewed the valid authority clause before terminating me. He reportedly said, "That's a legal technicality." It wasn't. In corporate governance, technicalities are architecture, and once that clause was activated, the issue was no longer whether the leak had been contained, it was whether leadership had voided the safety net, because insurance doesn't just cover accidents, it covers compliance. And compliance had been interrupted. By the time the insurance review was formally suspended, the tone inside the company shifted from defensive to desperate. When financial protection falters, leadership looks for leverage. Neil found his late that Monday afternoon. He summoned the engineering leads into the executive conference room. I wasn't present, but I reconstructed the conversation later from 3 separate accounts and one very important recording. The stated purpose of the meeting was clarification. The actual purpose was alignment. Marcus told me afterward that Neil opened with a controlled smile. "We need consistency," he said. "Regulators respond better when internal teams demonstrate unified decision-making." Unified decision-making. That phrase is corporate shorthand for narrative control. Neil then moved directly to the point. "Why didn't one of you authorize Level 3 when it became obvious escalation was required?" Marcus repeated what he had already documented. "We weren't authorized." Neil leaned forward. "You're senior engineers. You understand the systems." "Yes," Marcus replied. "And we understand federal compliance." Another engineer, Lena, added carefully. "Level 3 requires registered command authority unless a life safety override is formally declared." Neil's voice reportedly tightened. "So you're saying you watched damage escalate because of paperwork?" "It wasn't paperwork. It was governance." What happened next was the pivot. Neil suggested that the delay could be characterized differently, not as structural interruption, but as internal hesitation. "We're not assigning blame," he said, "but it would be helpful if your written statements reflected operational uncertainty rather than authorization limitations." Operational uncertainty. A subtle reframing. If the delay could be attributed to confusion, then executive termination would appear less causal. Marcus told me he felt the room compress at that moment. No one responded immediately. Neil continued, "If insurance concludes that leadership interference caused delay, coverage could be reduced. That affects everyone here. Bonuses, headcount, future projects. That was pressure, not overt threat, economic implication." And then he crossed a line. "I expect professionalism," he said, "which includes not exaggerating the impact of command hierarchy." Marcus later described that sentence as the moment his pulse changed, because hierarchy wasn't being exaggerated. It had been removed. What Neil didn't know was that Lena had set her phone face down on the conference table before the meeting began. Recording. Texas is a one-party consent state. She didn't announce it. She didn't need to. The audio captured everything: tone, phrasing, implication. It captured the suggestion that written statements be adjusted. It captured the linkage between financial consequences and narrative framing. It captured the subtle downgrade of compliance to paperwork. After the meeting, the engineers dispersed quietly. No confrontation, no dramatic exit. Marcus called me that evening. "They're trying to shift it," he said. "I know," I replied. "They implied we should soften our language. Did you know?" There was a pause. "And we have the meeting recorded." For the first time since the alarm had sounded, I felt something close to steadiness. Documentation neutralizes intimidation. The next morning, Lena requested a private meeting with General Counsel. She brought a copy of the audio file. Laura Chen listened without interruption. When it finished, she asked one question. Has this been shared anywhere else? Nalina answered. Laura nodded once. It won't be necessary. That afternoon, a brief but decisive internal memo circulated to executive leadership. All employee statements regarding the incident were to remain unaltered. Any attempt to influence or reinterpret documented testimony would be considered interference with compliance review. The memo did not name Neil directly. It didn't have to. The shift was immediate, by early evening. I received confirmation that the board had been notified of the recording's existence. Not the content. The existence. That distinction matters, because once a recording is acknowledged, destruction or suppression becomes legally perilous. Later that night, I was told that one board member had asked Neil directly whether he had attempted to influence technical testimony. His response was reportedly defensive. I was ensuring alignment. Alignment is a word executives use when pressure needs to sound strategic, but the recording didn't capture alignment. It captured leverage. And leverage, in the context of an ongoing federal review and suspended insurance claim, edges dangerously close to obstruction. The engineers hadn't defied him publicly. They hadn't protested. They had simply refused to rewrite physics and compliance. And now there was audio. Not rumor, not interpretation. Audio. Neil's position was no longer weakened by financial fallout alone. It was compromised by evidence of pressure. Because when leadership attempts to shape testimony during regulatory scrutiny, the issue shifts from misjudgment to intent. And intent is far harder to ensure. Once the recording surfaced, the atmosphere inside the company changed again. Pressure no longer flowed downward. It began moving sideways toward documentation. Regulatory reviews don't stop at transcripts. They expand outward, tracing structural decisions that may have shaped the event long before the alarm sounded. That's when maintenance budgets entered the conversation. I had objected to the cuts 8 months earlier. Neil had reduced preventive maintenance allocation by 14% during his first strategic restructuring. He called it operational efficiency recalibration. In practical terms, it meant extending valve inspection intervals, postponing auxiliary scrubber servicing, and consolidating monitoring diagnostics under a centralized analytics platform instead of dedicated on-site technicians. At the time, I documented my concerns in a quarterly safety assessment. Extended intervals increase risk of oscillation instability under high-pressure variants. I wrote, the board approved the restructuring anyway, and Neil signed the authorization. That signature was now part of the audit trail. The Environmental Protection Agency's request had already expanded beyond incident night communications. They wanted documentation of maintenance compliance for the preceding fiscal year. Insurance investigators mirrored the request. The engineering logs were precise. Valve 4's auxiliary stabilizer had been inspected within acceptable regulatory range, but at the outer limit of that range. The extension of inspection frequency had not violated federal law. It had narrowed the margin. There is a difference between illegal and imprudent. Internal compliance pulled archived board minutes from the restructuring vote. I was asked to review them for technical accuracy. There it was. Agenda Item 7, Safety Budget Optimization Initiative. Neil's language in the minutes was polished. Data-driven analytics allow us to streamline redundant manual oversight without compromising safety integrity. He had presented charts, projected savings, comparative benchmarking against competitors, and beneath the resolution approving the 14% maintenance reduction sat his signature. Clear. Intentional. The issue was not that maintenance had been ignored. The issue was that resilience had been reduced. During a follow-up call, external counsel asked me a pointed question. Would the incident have occurred absent the budget adjustments? I answered carefully. The initial leak originated from pressure variance. Reduced maintenance intervals did not cause the variance. However, narrower inspection margins increase system sensitivity under stress. Translation: the cut didn't create the spark. It thinned the firewalls. Later that afternoon, I learned that the board's audit committee had convened independently of executive leadership. That was new. Audit committees do not operate on emotion, they operate on fiduciary duty. When regulatory exposure intersects with executive decision making, they isolate variables, and maintenance allocation is a variable. By evening, internal auditors began pulling procurement records, vendor contracts, and service deferral approvals linked to the 14% reduction. They cross referenced them with incident impact projections, not to prove causation, to assess exposure. The engineer's recording had already weakened the narrative of internal hesitation. The suspended insurance claim had magnified financial risk. Now the maintenance reduction introduced a third axis governance prudence. I received a formal notice requesting a written assessment of whether extended inspection intervals materially altered system response time during the 9-minute escalation delay. My response was clinical. Extended intervals did not violate regulatory compliance thresholds. However, increased operational tolerance reduces redundancy capacity during simultaneous escalation and authority interruption. It was not dramatic language. It was engineering language. Late that night, Marcus texted me one sentence. They opened an internal audit. That mattered more than headlines. An internal audit is not symbolic. It creates subpoena-ready documentation. It freezes document destruction. It isolates executive access to sensitive files. By the next morning, a formal memo circulated to senior leadership. The audit committee had initiated a review into maintenance budget reductions and their potential impact on risk mitigation structures during the recent incident. Neil was not listed as chair. He was listed as subject of review. The signature at the bottom of the memo was not his. It was the board's independent audit director. Maintenance cuts had been positioned as efficiency. Now they were being evaluated as risk amplification. The narrative was no longer about a single night. It was about 8 months of decisions. And when governance shifts from operational defense to internal audit, leadership doesn't control the tempo anymore. Documentation does. By the time the audit committee initiated its review, the pressure had moved beyond regulators and insurers. It reached the shareholders. Quarterly performance calls are usually scripted, affairs, controlled optimism, strategic reframing, forward-looking statements wrapped in cautious language. This one was different. The numbers had already been disclosed. $180 million in projected loss exposure, insurance reimbursement pending review, federal inquiry active, internal audit underway. Investors don't ignore that combination. I wasn't scheduled to speak, but I was granted remote access as a compliance observer. My role had shifted again from terminated executive to technical reference point. Neil opened the call with prepared remarks. We experienced an unforeseen operational disruption, he said evenly. Our leadership team responded decisively to contain the issue. Decisively. I almost admired the restraint of that word. The first analyst question cut straight through it. Can you clarify whether the registered incident commander was terminated during the initial escalation window? There it was. Silence. Then controlled response. Personnel decisions and operational procedures are separate matters, Neil replied. They weren't. Another shareholder joined. Why fire the registered commander mid-crisis? The question wasn't hostile. It was surgical. Because institutional investors don't trade in outrage. They trade in governance risk. Neil's answer was polished. Leadership sometimes requires rapid restructuring to improve response efficiency. Restructuring. The euphemisms were thinning. A third voice entered the call, one I recognized as representing a major pension fund. Was escalation delayed due to removal of authorized command authority? That phrasing mattered. It mirrored regulatory language. Neil hesitated just long enough for it to register. Escalation occurred once sufficient situational clarity was achieved. That wasn't an answer. The call moderator shifted uncomfortably. But the damage was done. The question had entered the transcript. From my screen, I could see board members' faces in small video windows. Some were neutral, others were very still. Then, one shareholder requested disclosure of whether the valid authority clause under the insurance policy had been triggered. Neil attempted to redirect. We are in active dialogue with our insurer, but the shareholder persisted. Has the policy been suspended pending review of executive action? The word executive hung there. For the first time. The narrative was no longer about engineering delay. It was about leadership judgment. The call extended 15 minutes beyond schedule. Each question tightened the frame. Not about gas concentration, not about auxiliary valves, about governance. After the call ended, the board moved into closed session. I wasn't inside that room, but I was informed later by someone who was. The discussion was blunt. One director reportedly said, "We are defending decisions that may not be defensible." Another asked directly whether termination of the registered commander had been reviewed for compliance risk before execution. It had not. That fact was not disputed. The internal audit findings were still preliminary, but the maintenance reduction signature was already part of the file. The engineer recording existed. The insurance suspension stood. Then came the question that shifted the dynamic. Do we have confidence in current executive leadership to navigate regulatory exposure? That question doesn't require raised voices. It requires calculation. Neil defended himself. He framed the event as over-reliance on rigid hierarchy. He emphasized long-term efficiency. He argued that crisis response required flexibility. Flexibility in regulated industries. Flexibility is a dangerous word. One board member reportedly responded, "Flexibility without authority structure is liability." That sentence, I'm told, ended debate, because at that point, the issue was no longer public perception, it was fiduciary duty. When directors perceive personal exposure to regulatory scrutiny due to executive action, they reassess alignment quickly. Before adjournment, a motion was introduced. Closed ballot. Confidential executive confidence vote. Not symbolic. Binding. The board chair did not debate it. He asked only whether procedural requirements were met. They were. The request was seconded. And just like that, what began as a gas leak had evolved into a leadership referendum. Not in the press, not in headlines, behind a closed door, with paper ballots, and when governance reaches that stage. Outcomes are rarely ambiguous. The vote wasn't dramatic. It wasn't shouted. It wasn't televised. It didn't involve security guards or slammed doors. It was quiet, and that made it worse. I wasn't seated at the board table. I had been asked to wait in the adjacent conference room in case technical clarification was needed. Through the glass wall, I could see silhouettes shifting under recessed lighting. Papers moved, pens tapped. No one spoke loudly. Closed ballot. Confidential executive confidence vote. Binding. The board secretary distributed slips. One by one. Directors marked them, folded, placed them in a narrow wooden box that had probably never felt this heavy. Neil sat upright at the head of the table. Hands clasped, posture steady. He projected calm. He had built his brand on composure under pressure. He still believed this was navigable. The secretary counted the ballots twice, then handed the result to the board chair. I watched the chair read it once, then again. He didn't hesitate. The result appeared on the wall-mounted display standard procedure for formal documentation. 8-1. The numbers sat there longer than they needed to. Neil's face changed before anyone spoke. Not dramatically, not theatrically. Color drained, jaw tightened. Eyes fixed on the screen as if recalculating could alter arithmetic. 8-1. The lone vote to retain him had come from the only person who could legally cast it in his favor. Himself. No one rushed to fill the silence. The chair cleared his throat. "Mr. Krawick," he said evenly. "Effective immediately. You are suspended pending federal findings." There it was. Not terminated. Suspended. The language of caution. The language of procedure. But everyone in that room understood what suspension during active federal review meant. Neil opened his mouth slightly, then closed it. He glanced at the directors, searching for fracture lines, someone to challenge the result, someone to request reconsideration. No one moved, because this wasn't about loyalty anymore. It was about liability. He attempted control one last time, "This is premature," he said. "Regulatory review is ongoing. We shouldn't destabilize leadership during exposure." The chair didn't raise his voice. "The destabilization occurred at 2:14 a.m., he replied calmly. "This vote reflects fiduciary duty." That sentence landed harder than the numbers. Neil's hands, which had remained folded throughout, separated slightly on the table. A small movement, almost imperceptible, but telling. Public collapse isn't always loud. Sometimes it's administrative. The general counsel slid a folder across the table. Interim governance plan. Temporary executive oversight. Risk mitigation protocol during review. The structure was already drafted. That detail mattered. This hadn't been reactive. It had been considered. For the first time since the alarm screamed through the control room, I felt something close to equilibrium. Not satisfaction. Clarity. The board chair turned toward the glass wall and met my eyes. "Daisy," he said, loud enough to carry through the room, "we will require independent technical oversight during the federal inquiry." The word independent was deliberate. "I am no longer an employee." I replied evenly, "Correct." He said, "That is precisely the point." He stood, formalizing the transition. "We would like to engage you as an independent safety consultant to advise the board directly, not under executive reporting structure. Not under executive reporting structure." The distinction was surgical. No reinstatement, no return to hierarchy, no subordination to the very office that had revoked my authority, direct advisory to the board. I stepped into the room. Neil remained seated. Our eyes met briefly, not with hostility, but with something heavier: recognition. He had mistaken authority for control. The board had just reminded him they were not the same. "I will consider the advisory role," I said, "provided independence is contractual." The chair nodded once. "It will be." Neil finally stood. Not in protest, in procedure. Suspended executives exit without ceremony. No applause, no confrontation, just documentation. As he walked past me, he didn't speak. He didn't need to. The numbers on the wall had already spoken. 8-1, and in regulated industries. Arithmetic is unforgiving. The federal hearing room was colder than I expected. Not physically, structurally. Long table, microphones, recorders. No raised voices, no dramatic cross-examinations, just documentation and sequence. By then, my role had been formally defined as independent technical advisor to the board. I was not there as a terminated employee. I was there as a registered expert witness on industrial command governance. The Environmental Protection Agency panel began with procedural questions: timeline verification, command authority structure, maintenance intervals, insurance clause invocation, everything precise. When it was my turn, I raised my right hand and affirmed accuracy under penalty of perjury. The lead investigator asked, "Ms. Knox, in your professional opinion, what caused the $180 million loss?" The room did not shift. No one leaned forward. They were waiting for engineering, not emotion, I answered plainly. 9 minutes did not cause the loss. Removing authority did. The statement was entered into the record. I elaborated without embellishment. Industrial containment systems are designed to absorb mechanical variance. What they cannot absorb is interruption of designated escalation authority during active incident windows. Once command structure was revoked, escalation became legally ambiguous. That delay increased downstream exposure and regulatory impact. I was careful not to dramatize. Regulators distrust drama. They respect structure. The panel then directed attention to the termination timing. At approximately 2:14 a.m., your incident commander authorization was revoked. Was there any documented transfer of authority? No. Was that consistent with federal guidance for hazardous facilities? No. Silence followed. One investigator asked whether a subordinate could have legally activated Level 3 containment without formal designation. Technically possible, I said. Legally exposed. The difference hung there. Neil was present at the opposite table with external counsel. He did not interrupt. He took notes. Occasionally, he whispered to his attorney. The investigator turned to him. Mr. Crowick, were you aware that termination of registered command authority would prevent compliant escalation? His counsel intervened. Citing executive discretion and evolving situational assessment, the investigator did not challenge tone. He challenged sequence. Were you aware? Neil answered. I believed operational flexibility allowed for adaptive response. Flexibility again? The panel requested documentation confirming whether executive leadership had reviewed the valid authority clause prior to termination. External counsel produced internal policy acknowledgments bearing Neil's signature from the prior quarter. The investigator marked them as exhibits. Governance acknowledgement, maintenance reduction authorization, command structure certification. Each document connected. One panel member addressed me again. Would escalation have occurred faster had you retained authority? Yes. Would that likely have reduced financial and regulatory exposure? Yes. There was no visible reaction from the panel. That was how you knew the answer mattered. The hearing recessed for deliberation. Hours later, the findings summary was read into record. The Environmental Protection Agency did not conclude criminal misconduct. The containment ultimately succeeded. No fatalities occurred. Exposure levels were contained within statutory limits after escalation. But the panel identified material deviation from established command governance, contributing to delay. That phrase carried weight. More significantly, the Independent Board Audit Committee issued its parallel recommendation: gross negligence, not mechanical failure, not unforeseeable accident. Gross negligence in executive decision-making during active hazardous escalation. The recommendation was directed to the board. Termination of executive contract for cause. For cause eliminates severance protections. It also formalizes accountability. When the summary reached the board later that week, I was present only as consultant. I did not speak. The chair read the audit recommendation aloud. The language was clinical. Failure to uphold fiduciary duty through reckless disruption of federally registered command authority during active incident escalation. No raised voices. No applause. Just documentation. Neil did not argue this time. Perhaps he understood that sequence had defeated narrative. When governance shifts from optics to evidence, rhetoric loses oxygen. After the session concluded, one director approached me quietly. You were precise, she said. I was factual. I replied, precision isn't vengeance. It's alignment with reality. And reality, when documented properly, rarely needs amplification. It simply accumulates. 9 minutes did not cause the loss. Authority removed did. And now? The board had that in writing. The final board meeting was brief. No speeches, no attempts at reconciliation, just documentation and vote confirmation. The audit committee's recommendation had been reviewed. Council had verified contractual grounds, and the federal findings were formally entered into corporate record. Neil Crowick's suspension became termination for cause. Official, unambiguous. No severance package, no transitional advisory role. His executive access credentials were revoked before the meeting adjourned. The statement released to shareholders cited gross negligence in executive decision-making during a regulated incident. Measured language, permanent consequences. Beyond the corporate action, federal regulators initiated a separate personal compliance review. It wasn't criminal prosecution, but it carried professional implications, certifications, future board eligibility, executive liability insurance, all subject to scrutiny. Authority, once lost publicly, rarely reconstitutes quietly. Meanwhile, the market responded to something far less: emotional stability. Within 2 weeks of governance restructuring and public disclosure of independent oversight, the company's stock recovered most of its 11% drop. Analysts cited restored compliance confidence and reduced leadership volatility. Insurance negotiations resumed under revised documentation. Regulatory penalties were negotiated within projected range. Investors don't reward drama. They reward structure. As for me, I declined any permanent return to the company. I drafted incorporation papers instead. Knox Industrial Safety Advisory, Independent Governance Consulting, Emergency Command Auditing, Board-level compliance training. I didn't need a title anymore. I needed clarity. My first client was not a rival firm. It was the same board that had voted 8-1. This time, I reported directly to governance, not ego. On the day I signed my first advisory contract, a reporter asked whether I felt vindicated. I thought about that for a moment. Vindication implies emotion. What I felt was alignment. I wasn't dramatic. I said I was authorized. That sentence traveled further than I expected. Because in regulated industries, authority is not ornamental. It is structural. Remove it recklessly. And systems hesitate. And hesitation in high-risk environments converts quickly to cost. $180 million was the quantifiable damage, but the real cost was simpler. Someone confused power with authority. Power speaks loudly. Authority operates lawfully. Only one survives audit. And in the end, that difference became undeniable. There's something people don't talk about enough: the cost of silence. Not the dramatic kind, the quiet kind. The kind where you see a system bending under ego and you choose whether to document the truth or protect your comfort. That night, I didn't raise my voice. I didn't sabotage anything. I simply wrote the time-stamped email, stepped away when my authority was revoked, and let the record speak. That choice felt small in the moment. It wasn't. What I learned is this responsibility doesn't disappear just because someone louder walks into the room. Structure matters, process matters, and integrity isn't loud, it's consistent. If you were in my position, would you have protected yourself quietly? Or would you have tried to smooth things over to keep the peace? Think about that honestly. Where are you listening from right now? What city, what temperature outside your window? I always wonder who's out there when these stories travel beyond a boardroom. If this story made you think differently about leadership, authority, or accountability, consider subscribing. Not for me, for the next person who needs to hear that standing firm can protect more than just a reputation. When you like, comment, or share this video, you're helping the idea spread that integrity has consequences, and so does ego. Your click might reach someone who needs the courage to document the truth tomorrow. This story was fully created and produced by our team. We do not copy or borrow content from any other channel. Thank you for staying with us and listening until the end.